Welcome again. I'm delighted that you are able to join us for today's Minetta Transportation Institute Research Snaps webinar. I'm Dr. Karen Philbrick, and I'm the Executive Director of the Minetta Transportation Institute at San Jose State University. MTI leads two competitively selected multi-university consortia. One funded by the California State University Transportation Consortium, funded by California Senate Bill 1, and the second funded by the U.S. Department of Transportation, and that's the Minetta Consortium for Transportation Mobility. Our mission throughout all of our work is to increase the mobility of people and goods, and we accomplish this through surface transportation research, technology transfer, education, and workforce development. Today's webinar has some exciting information about exploring alternatives to solo driving to improve air quality and reduce congestion, a very, very critically and timely topic. During the webinar, if you have questions for our presenter, please submit them through the chat feature. We are recording this webinar and a link will be sent to you all shortly after we conclude. Today's presentation will focus on the Google and Via on-demand microtransit commute option called Via2G. Our speakers evaluated 3 months of pilot operations to understand the trends, challenges, and successes of microtransit commuting. To learn more, let's now turn to our experts. It gives me great pleasure to introduce today's speakers. We have Dr. Anne Brown, who's the Assistant Professor in the School of Planning, Public Policy, and Management at the University of Oregon. Her research examines transportation equity, shared mobility, and travel behavior. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Brown. We then have Dr. Alice Grossman. She is a Science and Technology Policy Fellow at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and she was a former senior policy analyst at the Enos Center for Transportation, where she focused on performance measurement and new technologies in transportation. Such an important area. We must have good measurements and objective data to support success. We also round out the team of participants by welcoming Lucy Noble, who is the Transportation Demand Management Program Manager at Google. Prior to joining Google, Lucy worked at UCLA as the marketing manager, and she owned a marketing firm in Los Angeles for several years. Thank you so much to all of you for taking the time to join us today to share with us the details of your exciting research. Now, in the first 20 minutes, we'll have you present, then we'll follow that up with a Q&A. So we're looking forward to hearing you. Time is limited, so please take it away.
Great, thank you so much, Karen. Can you guys hear me all right?
Yes.
Great, and do we have Lucy on now, or should we go ahead?
You can go ahead, and Irma, can you please move Lucy up? She joined as an attendee.
Great, glad she could join us. So we're going to be talking today a little bit about the background, the methodologies, and our findings from this research collaborative of a microtransit pilot that Google started in partnership with Via to try to get their employees to and from their campuses in Mountain View and Sunnyvale to try to reduce the single occupancy vehicle driving during commuting. Let's see if I can get these slides going. Great. So we're going to start off and just give a little bit of an overview of sort of the background and Google's motivation for starting this pilot project, as well as our role, Anne and my role as researchers to evaluate this project, which really started at the very beginning so that we could work together on the necessary data collection to be able to do the analysis and evaluation that could both meet our researcher objectives and the objectives of Google as an employer to try to provide more alternatives to their employees and figure out how they could incentivize workers to take non-single occupancy modes to get to and from work. And we're going to end with a few recommendations of what we've found from the pilot data that we've been able to analyze so far. So starting off with the Google context, I'm going to try to channel Lucy here from the Google perspective, thinking
Lucy's
about—
actually joined us.
Oh,
yeah, I'm actually here. I actually had to join by phone. Can you guys see me okay?
Yes. Yes. All right. I will turn it right over to you, Lucy.
Great. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Sorry, I was having some technical difficulties on my laptop, but I I'm glad I'm able to join on the phone. But yeah, again, I'm Lucy Noble. I'm the TDM program manager here at Google in the Bay Area. And our focus is to reduce solo drive trips in Mountain View and Sunnyvale, which is in Silicon Valley, where we have most of our employees. And we're committed to reducing traffic and greenhouse gas emissions and parking demand by reducing those solo drive trips. And so as you can see here, if you go to the next slide, you can see our mode split. We are currently doing pretty well compared to what the county is doing and compared to some of our other employers that are in the area. Only about 46 to 42% of our employees are driving solo to work. Most of our employees are commuting to work more sustainably. So about a third of our employees are taking the shuttle to work. So we have a commuter shuttle program, and they're using that on a regular basis. And that's great for people who are commuting about 15 miles or more. But what we've learned is that some of our employees that live nearby, probably about 5 to 10 miles, are usually driving to work. And so we really wanted to work on reducing that that mode split as well. So we worked with Via to launch this pilot, and we wanted to share the results. So for the area that we test, we only launched the pilot in the Mountain View and Sunnyvale area. And in that area, in Sunnyvale, the drive alone rate during the pilot dropped from 53 to 46%. And in Mountain View, it dropped from 42 to 39%. So that's much more significant than we had planned for, and that was a great result. And Alice and Anne will tell you how we did all of that. So if you go to the next slide, please. Sorry, I'm toggling back and forth so I can see. Again, the goal of the project is to reduce parking, reduce the amount of people driving alone. And we partnered with Via on a shared microtransit option. So this Via On Demand is an on-demand service. You call it when you need a ride, and it's dynamic. So it's different from our standard fixed route shuttles that are on a schedule. So we launched this pilot in phases, and we started in October of 2019. But was sadly suspended in March of 2020 due to the mandatory work from home orders. But Anne and Alice, you're going to take it away and share how we designed the pilot and some of the research around how the folks used it and our success rates. So take it away.
Alice, you're muted.
Thank you. I'm just going to start real quick with some of the incentives to doing this project, both from Google's perspective, but also from transportation researchers' perspective, and why Anne and I were particularly interested in looking at this data and seeing what we could find. And that's thinking about sort of the benefits of success in three different ways, which is, as researchers, we're usually more focused on these benefits to society and to commuters. And getting people out of single occupancy vehicles is obviously going to help reduce congestion, which will in turn have positive benefits on air quality and noise along these corridors. And for commuters to be able to have options that's not that single occupancy vehicle can help them with their own personal costs, including fuel and parking, just generally owning and operating a vehicle, and also can reduce stress and provide extra time for multitasking, either working or listening to music or talking on the phone, or whatever it is that people can commit their time and attention to when they're not focusing on driving their own vehicle. And Lucy kind of already covered why the employer was interested in this and what the benefits to success were for that. So I'm going to go ahead and move along to the research design. This was really, I think, the most important part of thinking about the research design of this project is that it was very important for us to work together as researchers with Google as the sort of spearhead of the project, and with Via as the transportation provider. So the most important parts were kind of starting up here at the top, where Google sort of defined what their goals and their problem statement was, which is, getting people out of these single occupancy vehicles to commute to and from their campuses. And we needed to think as researchers what our research questions were and how we were going to be able to answer those. And that was really thinking about sort of looking at this as an example. How can we see trends in people choosing to take services like shared microtransit? What are the characteristics about those people in their households, and what are the characteristics about the service and the performance of the service that lead to higher ridership, which is, in this case, one of the goals of the program. And so that kind of started up here with a lot of collaboration and discussion, and really jumps down to an important part also of this project and data monitoring. And that was really working from the very beginning to make sure that we were going to have the data available to us from Via, from Google, and in the levels of disaggregation that we wanted to be able to do the analyses that Anne is going to go into more depth with later. So I just want to stress that anybody who's thinking about similar types of project, it's this collaborative planning process that really allows us to be able to work together and get those research outcomes that end up answering both the researcher questions and the employer sponsor questions. So from the research perspective, what Anne and I were thinking about while we were helping shape this project and getting those data asks and then going through the analyses, it was really thinking about, the sort of overall goal. I'm going to start from the bottom here, was evaluating that service performance by looking at different aspects of that service and connecting that back up to this top bullet point, which is monitoring new and repeat riders of the service. So if our goal here is to get people out of single occupancy vehicles and into shared modes, one of which would be the Via2G mode, it's really figuring out sort of how to connect those dots and looking at things like cancellations and walk distances and the types of people that are choosing to take this service, what modes they're switching from. That was an important one to try to look at as well. And then going on that more granular level, and this gets back to making sure we have the data sharing at the beginning as well, which is examining those temporal patterns, day of week, time of day, what types of maybe trip chaining or different types of trips people might be taking to and from work as well. That's not just home to work and work to home. And so we want to make sure we could capture all of this moving forward. And here's the context. I want to give a little bit of geographical context before we get into the exact data and analyses that we did. So the two Google campuses in question are these two gray polygons, and you can see the Mountain View campus and the Sunnyvale campus. And then the zones around them are the zones that employees live in that had access to the Via2G service to be able to get to and from those campuses. So the simple way to explain the service is you could start and end in one of these colorful, home-based zones, and you can start and end at one of these gray Google campus zones. And there was a slow rollout, so we started taking data a little bit after the pilot had begun to ramp up because it was in stages. And we started doing analysis. We were taking data the whole time. But we wanted to make sure that we got a good representation once people were aware of the service, and that they could take it, and that we had large enough amounts of data to be able to do the analyses we wanted. So just to give a sense of how that rollout worked, Google started offering the Via2G service at the Sunnyvale campus here in the middle, and they rolled out gradually in Sunnyvale Central, and then in the east, and then in the west, and then started opening up the Mountain View campus also. And as we began to open up Via2G service in these Mountain View polygon service areas over here, COVID hit. As Lucy said, we had to shut the program down, the pilot down. And so we didn't really get a full sense of if it had been available to all of these service areas, what we would have seen, but we definitely saw a lot of the trends moving forward as we went. The service was available during morning and evening peak hours. So between 7 and 10 a.m. and between 4 and 7 p.m. Monday through Friday. And we collected data, as I said, from Via and also from an employee survey, and we were able to link those data with a rider ID. So we were able to look at the connections between travel behavior and some very basic demographics like vehicle ownership and availability in a household. And so this is just an overview of those data that we collected. And if you think back to that flow chart about our project planning, again, you'll see that this was really something very important from the beginning of the project. And then to the end, once we get all the way into the recommendations, thinking about being able to do, as you mentioned at the very beginning, Karen, that important performance management and data-driven assessment of these types of programs. And so with that, I am going to turn it over to Anne.
Great, thanks, Lucy and Alice. So I'm going to present an overview of research findings, some of the biggest level, big takeaways from the research. I'm happy to answer any specifics during the Q&A as well. Next slide, Alice. So one question we also had was, do people know about the Via2G program? Are they interested in it before we even rolled out the service? So the big line takeaway is that most people had never heard of it. About 90% had never heard of this. And this, you can assume, probably applies to other places as well. A lot of people don't know what microtransit is, right? It's still pretty new, an unfamiliar service, but there's a lot of interest. So at least among the Google employees, 92% were interested in this type of service. So a lot of excitement around the potential to get free rides to and from work on demand. Among looking at who was interested, there was a little bit more interest among those without cars. So those that don't have reliable access to car travel to and from work were slightly more interested, although interest spanned both car owners and non-car owners. And that there was more interest also in those who drove more frequently to work. In other words, those who drove 4 or 5 days per week were slightly more interested than those who drove 1 or 2 among drivers. Next slide, Alice. Overall, there were about 8,600 trip requests that resulted in a ride during these initial, essentially 2.5 months. Most of the requests that people submitted to Via were fulfilled. Those that weren't, the vast majority, were actually just outside of operating times. And I'll talk a little bit more about when those rides are, because it really hints at when designing a service and thinking about expanding a service, about when's the demand. And that could vary a lot by place to place, or the purpose of a service. Overall, we had about 900 employees who requested at least 1 ride. And overall, we saw ridership grow up into the point that the service was shut down in March due to COVID. So again, we would have been curious to see what that timeline looked like even farther out, but overall, we saw a lot of growth as the program was rolled out and as people increasingly tried the service. Most people also used Via2G more than once. So about 3/4 you took at least 2 Via2G trips. Overall, those that completed at least 1 ride completed on average about 2.5 trips per week. So this means it wasn't the dominant mode. People weren't taking all their trips to and from work on Via2G, but it provided an occasional trip for users. So you can think about what role that might play in people's travel behavior, right? Does it provide that trip what, oh, you know, your bus wasn't running or you're carrying a lot of things? Maybe this is the service that fills in that gap for you. The other thing we found was that a lower share of reoccurring users had cars available for commuting compared to surveyed Google employees. In other words, those with the least car access personally were most likely to be reoccurring users for this service. Next slide, Alice. Looking at patterns over time, we saw a reasonably even distribution of trip requests throughout the week. You can see there's a few little requests on Saturday and Sunday. The services weren't operating then, although there were certainly a few hopeful employees asking for rides then. We did see more trips in the middle of the week compared to Monday and Friday, but overall quite robust trip requesting throughout the week. Next slide, Alice. So this graph shows over the time of day when people were requesting trips. And the dark gray lines are those hours inside of the pilot operating times. And so the pilot only offered rides in the morning commute hours and the evening commute hours. And so all those little gray lines, the little short ones, are when people were requesting trips outside of the operating times. So you see there's some demand during the middle of the day, as well as kind of in that 7 o'clock period right after the pilot hours. ended. And so again, this would likely vary for all of you in the audience. This would likely vary by program, employee, employer location, or type. So thinking about when is the most demand for a service is an important consideration. Next slide, Alice. Okay, looking at what types of trips were people taking? On average, people were walking a really short distance to trips. It's a little bit like Uber Express, if anyone's taken that, where you walk to make the route more efficient. But on average, people are only walking 150 feet. So it's a really short distance. Trips were about 3.4 miles in 18 minutes on average. And one of the things that certainly struck us was how accurate the estimated arrival times were. So on average, Via would estimate trips would arrive in about 11 minutes, and actually they arrived in about 11.2 minutes. So 94% of trips arrived within a 5-minute wait time. So a pretty decent, a pretty good estimating time. We didn't find any correlation between the estimated and actual wait times for number of trips that employees end up taking. In other words, we really saw accurate arrival time. So people signed up for more rides. And that there was a high degree of sharing with other riders. So about 3/4 of trips were shared or matched with another rider. Next slide, Alice. And then lastly, some recommendations, and we can think about some recommendations that apply to Google in this specific case, but also you can think about how this might apply to other cases that you all might be considering. And so from the data we saw, one recommendation is to think about ways to minimize deadheading. In other words, the time and miles that the drivers are, the Via drivers are driving without passengers in the car. So that's about more efficient routing. The second recommendation is to focus programming and evaluations on employees who always drive. So that's a big group of people, and even marginal differences in their driving behaviors can make a pretty big difference overall, as well as those who complete errands to or from work. So that was a group we found a little tricky to get on the Via2G service. They were less likely to take the service compared to other travelers. And so we can think about why might that be. Maybe their errands aren't within the service area. It's just a complicated trip pattern. So it can involve some more investigation about how do you serve travelers who are completing errands to and from work and doing a trip chain. Third, thinking about what should the hours be as this program potentially moves from pilot into full program phase. So we saw, based on the pilot times, at least these first couple months, that there was some, although much lower, demand in the middle of the day, and then some demand also for trips in the 7 o'clock range. So again, this is going to vary a lot by context, but thinking about when is the demand for your service. If you're a transit agency, when is your service maybe less robust? Is it in the middle of the night? Is it in early mornings, for example? When might there be this unmet demand for the other services available? And then lastly, as any good researchers will say, we recommend that Via2G continue being evaluated moving forward, so that we can continue to learn from these programs and iterate to make it the best possible program for employees and travelers. And with that, thanks so much. And we're going to open it up for questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much. That was a super interesting presentation. And we do have several questions in the Q&A feature. But before we do that, I'd just like to document 2 observations. Alice, when you were talking about some of the benefits to employees, you said it kindles relationships. And I thought that was a particularly interesting observation, because what we know from the literature is that social support really mitigates the impact of stress and stressful events. So having that kind of relationship to and from work, I could see being of great value. And I'm so pleased to see that interpersonal benefit documented. So thank you. And then, Anne, you were just talking about recommendations, and I noted recommendation 4 dealt with kind of the changing work environment as a result of COVID. And I noticed earlier in the presentation, you documented the number of people working remotely. I'm very curious about how this might fit into the repopulation plans of the Google campuses. And Lucy, that's likely a question for you. Do you have any comments about that? Like what the plan is going forward?
Yeah, so recently our CEO announced a hybrid flexible work approach, where we're still voluntarily working from home, and that ends in September. So in September, Our workforce, if we're in our county where we're at level 2 or better, we're asked to return to the office, but in a much more flexible time frame, in a flexible work week. So we're required to be in the office 3 days a week, and then the additional 2 days is optional, whether you want to work from the office or work from home. And so that actually gives us a great opportunity to, well, first of all, the whole return to office gives us a great opportunity to help people change their behaviors. Whatever behavior that they had before is going to be different, whether they are still living in the same area, moved to a new location. But because we're now creating a new habit, I think it's a great opportunity to help folks transition out of their car and try something new, whether it's this or biking or anything else. But also because of this hybrid work week, hopefully folks are willing to try something new for those 3 days that they're required to head into the office. And which 3 days it is, we're still working with the different product areas to determine. But I think most people are choosing Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. So we'll probably see a lighter travel pattern on Mondays and Fridays, and we'll adjust. So we're planning to relaunch the pilot, Via2G pilot, in sometime in the next 2 months before September. So when folks get back to the office, they have this option available to them. But we'll adjust the weeks, every day of the week as we go to based on demand and making sure that we do meet demand for both morning and evening rides.
And the pattern might be similar to what Anne just presented, because Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday were already the highest demand days, right? So this will
Exactly,
be so cool in some ways that this disruption happened, to see in the real world what the impact is. Okay, let's get to the questions here. What are the operating costs per hour or operating costs per trip? And do you consider trips to be round trip or one way?
So each trip is one way, because some people take a morning trip and they do something else in the evening, or they get dropped off in the morning and they take Via2G home. So we count each trip as a one-way trip. We're actually, part of this research, we did not look at the budget, not that we didn't look at the budget, but it wasn't part of the analysis. We are tracking our budget and how cost efficient it is. But it takes definitely a few months for the cost efficiency to develop. And so that was not part of this analysis.
Understood. Thank you very much. Next question from our guest named Lenny. Did you ask employee participants whether they had children?
I don't know if Alice or I want to take that, but that we did not. That's actually one of those demographics questions that we're not allowed to ask.
We did ask about trip chaining, which sometimes can be correlated with the number of people in a household, although it isn't necessarily. But you know, the idea of if you have to drop or pick up a child from childcare might have been captured in that, but it is still definitely a separate data field than number of people in a household.
Sure, sure. And we understand restrictions around those types of questions. How long did it take for employees to start using this platform, and how does it correlate with the amount of advertising or communications about the service? And ladies, I'm just throwing these questions out there because I'm not sure which of you are most adept at answering them. So please, I apologize, it's not a little bit more formal in my approach.
No worries. So we did a series of emails and email marketing campaigns. And because we launched in phases, it was we had to structure it in a particular way. I think when Alice showed the map, we launched a corridor and another corridor at a time to make the routes more efficient. So the emails that we sent out, it had multiple steps. So it might, for someone that was in the right area at the right time, they probably was able to take a ride immediately. But then we had to continue to email the people who, as we opened up new zones, that, hey, now it's available to them. We didn't really track how long it took for them to know about the service to when they took a ride. But that's something that we can definitely track in the next round.
Very good. And just a quick question to our researchers. It is 10:30 and I want to be very respectful of your time, but we have 6 questions remaining. Would you be willing to stick around for a few more minutes? Okay, excellent. So for those of you who must disconnect at this time, thank you so much for joining us today. We've just popped a link to their final report into the chat feature. Have a look, and if you don't have time to digest the complete report, you can look to the research brief to gain the highlights. Thanks again for joining us today, and we'll also send you a video of this particular presentation. So going back to our questions here, what was the estimated number of personal vehicles taken off the road as people started using this service? If you have that data, of course.
I don't know if we have that number off the top of our head. I don't know, Anne, if you want to flip through some charts and see if we've got some estimates. It's hard to know exactly, even when we ask, we know sort of what people were doing before, and Anne talked a little bit about how it seemed like most people who chose to use this service were using it 1 or 2 days a week, whereas they also used to be using other shared modes, maybe the Google bus or some other way to get to work. So there's no way to know exactly how many single occupancy vehicles were taken off the road, but we did see that there was a bit of a shift, as Lucy noted at the beginning also, of that share of Google employees that was using single occupancy vehicles before, and that share decreased after.
Excellent. And so a bit about driver health. How long were the driver shifts?
Yeah, so the morning shift, it was about 4 hours in the morning and 4 hours in the evening. And we have a different service in the middle of the day. So our drivers were able to work, in the morning shift, part of the afternoon hours, and then they would shift to the next afternoon hour, and then the evening shift. So we had drivers that worked in the morning and evening, and they did something else in the middle of the day. It was very flexible for our drivers.
Oh, very good. Okay, thank you. Now, we've talked about congestion reduction, and we know that's a great metric, but there are some others. Was there any emphasis placed on greenhouse gas reduction as a metric?
And we weren't able to necessarily. Oh, Anne, did you want to take this?
It's fine. I'm happy to if you've been doing a lot of the work, Alice. I'm happy to step in. I'll say I think that was definitely a goal of the program, but it wasn't something we directly measured. And part of that is just simply the complexity of evaluating greenhouse gas emissions. So we'd have to look at the Via2G vehicles and compare exactly what mode were they replacing with that specific trip. And to Alice's point, while we asked people how they traveled to work prior to the pilot, we weren't surveying them about every trip they took during and saying, okay, this trip you just took, how would you have made it otherwise? We know that about a third of users drove 5 days a week previously, and another 26% drove 1 to 4 days. So we can do some really rough estimates. We know there were personal vehicle reductions, and we can assume because there was some pooling happening in these, likely if you're replacing driving alone with some degree of pooling, you're seeing improved GHD. But the exact amount is really was not in our scope at this point.
Got it. But speaking along the same lines of the metrics, what metric will this pilot need to make for it to be a permanent transportation option for employees? Like, what kind of success, Lucy, do we need to see to make this a permanent program?
Yeah, so as we're relaunching, we're definitely considering the new KPIs that we're tracking. Definitely one of the things that we want to ensure is that these are still continue to be shared rides. So as I mentioned before, each ride has about 3 passengers, and that is a very good metric for us for these particular vehicles. We're using minivans right now. And so we want to definitely maintain that 3 head count per vehicle as we're relaunching. But because we have this hybrid approach, it might get a while for us to get to that number, but we're definitely aiming higher. Another metric that we're looking at is definitely the costs. Again, it takes time to build up that efficiency in terms of the shared ridership, the cost, and our customer experience. We want to make sure that our customer has a great experience so that we're not expanding too quickly. We want to graduate to larger vehicles, but we want to make sure that people are still having a great experience. They're not walking too far. They're not getting crowded. They're still getting their rides at a good time frame. So we're looking at a lot of different measures. And there's no like strict line that once it passes this threshold, it's going to graduate into a program. But we're hoping that it's going to graduate into a program as we see these efficiencies grow.
Lucy, that was a great answer. And if I didn't know better, it dovetails so well into the next question. I think that you're looking at the same questions I am. Specifically, Gary asked what the average vehicle occupancy was, and I believe you just answered that with a head count of 3. And then the second part to that question is, were employees satisfied with their trip duration and out of direction travel?
Yeah, for the most part, everyone was pretty satisfied because we had so much control over the service. It was our drivers, our vehicles. When we saw the numbers of like wait time increase, or if people were giving us a particular feedback about anything, we reacted immediately and had those resolved. It's much different than like if we did it with another type of service, but this because we had full control of the operations, we were able to adjust the experience for our users immediately. So if there was a longer wait time, more than what we expected, and that was definitely one of the measures that we were looking at, we would adjust and add vehicles and add drivers to that shift the next day, or we would adjust however we needed to.
So very dynamic in the way that you responded to the feedback that was received. And just a question, did you close the loop with the person submitting that feedback? So to tell them how it was addressed?
Yes, we had a dispatch team and customer service team in one. And so when they get these requests, they definitely let them know that, hey, we resolved these issues.
Oh, you're giving me goosebumps with all the answers are just like a dream come true here. What percentage of the drive time is deadheading? Because you talked about that being one of the things we needed to limit here. And that might be more appropriate for you. Do you have any data about that?
We don't. So we have, we really were focusing on the people riding, not necessarily the vehicles themselves. So our metrics, at least at this phase of the project, were on mode shift and trip counts and when those trips were happening and where. So maybe Lucy knows that, but that wasn't one of our key performance indicators.
Yeah, I don't have that metric either, but I can imagine it's close to probably 50% because in the morning, all the trips are going one direction towards the office. And in the evening, all the trips are going out. I think there is some usage of that deadhead, but I don't know the exact percentage, but it's probably about half.
Sure, and that makes perfect sense, of course. And talking about service area, we did see that great map that you put up, Alice, but one of the questions we've received from a participant is, did you ever provide service to Google's building in the Wisman area of Mountain View? I don't know if I'm saying that correctly.
Yeah, maybe I'll answer that because I know the area a little bit better. We did not provide service to the Wisman area at that time because it was still a pilot, and we wanted to concentrate the pilot area so that the routes would be more efficient. So as Alice presented the map, you can see like we launched in corridors rather than by like zip codes. That was more horizontal. That way, when the vehicles go up a corridor, they can pick up people along the way and they're not going zigzagging. And where Wisman is located, it was a little bit out of the area. So eventually we will launch to Wisman, but right now we were focused on the Moffett Park area in Sunnyvale and then North Bay Shore in Mountain View.
Perfect, got it, thank you. And we're on our last question here. And I just like to note, I'm monitoring everything on my screen. Only 20% of our guests have had to disengage from this conversation. And usually people's schedules so tight, they're off right at 10:30. So I think that speaks to the power of the content. So it's super exciting. Last question. Could you please help explain what the service offering really is? Is Via2G available to other users, or was this a service specifically developed for and operated by Google? I think this question's been answered during some of the comments, but I'm assuming this is a small shuttle bus operated on demand at no cost to the user.
Right, so it's actually minivans. We have a series of minivans. It is a on-demand service, dynamic routing. So it's much like a Uber Pool or Lyft shared, but it's a minivan, so we're able to pick up a lot more passengers than your standard Lyft or Uber. And it's a free service for our employees. And so right now it's a closed loop for only our employees to take to commute for their commute to work. So it's only operating in the morning hours and the evening hours to meet that demand.
Perfect. And so I would just like to thank all of the people who attended today, and a special nod to Miss Amy Stearns, who is our federal grant manager at the U.S. Department of Transportation, and a professional I've worked with for 2 decades. A true pleasure to see you with us today, Amy. And to Dr. Alice Grossman, Dr. Ann Brown, and to Lucy Noble, thank you so much for sharing your time with us and your expertise. This was really, I mean, I know I have goosebumps. This was really spot on in terms of excitement and the critical nature of the research. So thank you again. And we hope for all of those that attended today that you'll tune in for future research snaps. Have a great day, everybody. Stay safe and enjoy getting back to work and out on the roads.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Bye.